What we'll do in this session is discuss resource sharing concepts. As the title suggests, we will go through concepts. That is, we'll try to speak about the different entities, the different features, objects, workflows, whatever that makes this work. And if we have time, then towards the end of the presentation, perhaps also look at some screens just to kind of make everything more concrete and understand better. So we'll talk about some issues that have to do with the terminology that we use. Terminology is very important when we discuss this. There are a number of different terminologies out there that have been used by different Exlibris products, or even different terminologies that have been used within the same Exlibris products. So we'll spend a couple of minutes on the terminology that we intend to use and go into some of the concepts and the workflow that make up the Alma resource sharing. Okay, so let's start with a few comments about terminology. When we're talking about the resource sharing request, we are of course talking about two institutions exchanging resources. That is, a patron of one institution getting resources that belong to another institution, with its home institution being an intermediary, meaning the patron is asking its own institution to help him get a resource that is currently owned by a different institution. That's what we used to call ILL, interlibrary loan. But in Alma, when we're talking about resource sharing, we're also including other types of resource sharing. That includes what we used to call consortial borrowing. That is situations where a patron is directly requesting a resource and directly getting a resource of another institution. So resource sharing in Alma really refers to both of these types. Some of this is already supported in Alma, that is some of the ILL workflows, and we have further down plans to put into Alma Fulfillment also supports for the other type of resource sharing, but that's future plans. What we'll focus on in this presentation is the more traditional type of resource sharing, what we used to call ILL, which again is a resource sharing that is done by two institutions on behalf of the requesting patron. So the requesting patron may be a student, may be a researcher, maybe anybody that is entitled to receive fulfillment services from an institution. So what this patron is going to be placing is what we call a borrowing request. But there are other terminologies for this type of request, but that's perhaps the one that is the clearest and easiest to use. It means a request to borrow something. The request is managed by a resource sharing system. In this case, this resource sharing system has the role of a borrowing resource sharing system, meaning it's going to take the role of implementing the borrowing side of the resource sharing process. As a resource sharing system, it's involved in doing any action, processing any action that is required in order to enable the patron to get the resource that the patron is interested in. So the resource sharing system is going to do a bunch of things that have to do with finding out who has this resource, making contact with that institution, and eventually obtaining the resource and getting it to the hands of the patron. So we'll go into the different parts, the different actions this resource sharing system does as we go on in this session. But this resource sharing system is what's standing between the requesting patron and the resource. Interacting with the system is also a resource sharing operator. The resource operator is the operator that takes care of the request, makes sure the request is processed correctly, manages situations where something goes wrong with the request. In principle, it would be best if the resource sharing operator would not be needed, if the request could be fully automated and the requesting patron would be able to just submit the request and just get the resource without any resource sharing operator work being done in between. But in reality, of course, many times the resource sharing operator is needed in the process and is going to be interacting with the system to help the request get to its required destination. What this resource sharing system is going to be doing is going to be finding a lender and sending the request out to the lender and then communicating with the lender. The way that this is going to be done is that the borrowing request is going to be linked or associated with a bunch of what we call partners or potential suppliers. Actually, the ALMA internal terminology would be partner. But what these are potential suppliers. That is a bunch of institutions that probably own the resource or are probably able to supply the resource to the requester. And there will be the different partners, resource sharing borrowing, the borrowing resource sharing system will be communicating with in order to obtain the resource. We call this list a ROTA. ROTA is a list, an ordered list, a sorted one, of potential suppliers, that is, suppliers or partners that have been identified by the borrowing system as potential suppliers, meaning they own the resource and may be willing to supply it to our borrower. So that's our ROTA. Eventually, the ROTA means, or behind each partner in this ROTA, there is some lending resource sharing system. Meaning if the borrowing system selects the first partner, it's actually going to be communicating with the lending resource sharing system, which manages or is managed by that partner, and so on. So each partner in the ROTA is actually a resource sharing system with which the borrowing system will be communicating. So if we take a look at the lending side, well, on the lending side, the partner, the potential supplier, actually also runs its own resource sharing system. But in this role, being a lender, we can call this resource sharing system the lending resource sharing system, because this resource sharing system is going to be, in this process, is going to be managing the lending side of the request. So what we have on this side of the process is another resource sharing operator, one at the lending institution, which is interacting with the lending resource sharing system, but this time this operator is in charge of fetching the resource that has been requested and making sure that it's shipped away to the requester, the borrowing institution that has requested this resource. So we have the lending resource sharing system with the operator there, and this would be our full picture. We have the borrowing request with the resource sharing system. We have the patron and the operator, and on the right side we have the lending request, which is registered at the lending institution, where a resource sharing system is going to be managed to fulfill the request and get it to the requesting patron. Another key concept in resource sharing request is the resource sharing library. Actually, every request that is managed in ALMA is managed by a resource sharing library. So the resource sharing library, or you may call it resource sharing department, in the resource sharing library is actually the administrative unit that manages all aspects of the resource sharing transaction, regardless of whether the institution is participating in the ILL transaction as a borrower or as a lender. In both cases, the request is going to be managed by a resource sharing library. At the resource sharing library, there are operators, staff operators, that have a role within the resource sharing library. So they have a role of managing the resource sharing requests, and the role's scope is the resource sharing library. Now, the basic model would be where there's a single resource sharing library. So if I go back to this slide, where there's a single resource sharing library, say in both sides, the borrowing and the lending. And these two resource sharing libraries communicate between them, the borrower telling the lender, get me this resource, the lender sending it away. That would be the most basic model. However, there may be situations where there may be multiple resource sharing libraries. either at the borrowing side or at the lending side, or of course at both sides, independently of course of each other. So we may have more than one resource sharing library. What that means is that we may have patrons that are associated or affiliated with a resource sharing library. That means that any request submitted by these patrons is going to be managed by the resource sharing library with which they're affiliated. So they have a predefined set resource sharing library which is going to be managing their resource sharing request. In addition, the resource sharing library has its pool of requests. So requests get into the resource library. Its resource sharing library is going to be managing its own pool of requests and only its own pool of requests, and not seeing in any way requests that belong to another resource sharing library. They have their own staff. So they may have operators that operate at a specific resource sharing library. They may have roles at more than one resource sharing library, but they always work in the context of a single resource sharing library, viewing the requests of that resource sharing library only. The resource sharing library is also linked to libraries within the institution, which serves two purposes. If the resource sharing library is serving as a borrower, then these libraries are actually potential pickup locations, meaning the patrons that have submitted a request to this resource sharing library may request to receive their physical resources at any of the libraries that are associated with this resource sharing library. That's one aspect of it, when the resource sharing library is the borrower. Another aspect of it would be when the resource sharing library is actually a lender. In that case, the libraries that are associated with the resource sharing library really mean where that resource sharing library items from. So if a resource sharing library can draw items only from library A and library B, then if a lending request comes into the system and an inventory that may match this request exists in library C, this resource sharing library is not going to be able to get this resource. So if we have a resource sharing library that manages the medical library, it may not be able to use resources that belong to the law library, just as an example. So this idea of multiple resource sharing libraries is critical in managing resource sharing. Some of the aspects that I've just described to you are still in development and will be made part of the resource sharing functionality in the next couple of months. But the idea would be to manage requests in the same manner that I've described to you right now. Okay, so that's the resource sharing libraries. The other key concept that we have to understand when discussing resource sharing is the different models that exist out there. There are different flavors, and I've just commented on that when we started the discussion on the basic difference between what we traditionally called ILL, interlibrary loan, and traditionally called consortial borrowing. These are two different types of resource sharing. But as I said, we're going to be focusing on the ILL type. And within this type, there are also different ways to manage resource sharing requests. And in Alma, we're going to be managing more than a single model of this. So one type is already in place. Actually, both types are already in place, but development is still going to be done around one of them. First one is what we call the broker-based model. In this model, Alma interacts for a resource sharing request using some mediator, some other system that is really managing the resource sharing process. So the system we see in the center of this diagram is a resource sharing system that is able to identify or is able to do all of the roles that a resource sharing system has, that is, identify who owns the system, make contact with that potential lender, register the request as a lender, being able to manage the communications between borrower and lender. All of this happens at the system that is in the center of this diagram, the resource sharing system. Alma in this serves for the library side, or the internal library side of the process. That is, in order to fulfill a request, things have to happen within the library. items have to be moved between different departments or circulation desk within the library. Items have to be loaned out or have to be received back, checked in into the library. All of that is managed by ALMA as the library system. But ALMA communicates with the resource sharing system via protocol, via NCIP protocol, which will expand a bit later on. So as you see in this diagram, ALMA may be on both sides of the communication, or ALMA may be communicating with another system. It doesn't make a difference. In either case, there is a broker system in between. So even if ALMA is on both sides, there's a borrowing institution that is ALMA and a lending institution that is ALMA. If the broker model is used, then the broker is in between them, managing the communications between the two institutions. In other models, what we call the peer-to-peer model. In this case, ALMA directly communicates with any other partner as a borrower or as a lender. So there's no intermediary in between. There's direct communication. This obviously means that ALMA takes the full responsibility over the request. Full responsibility means finding out who has the resource, making contact, everything that I've mentioned before. And the communication itself is managed in one of a couple of possible ways. One option that is already supported is the British Library ArtMail, which is a format that is used by the British Library for placing requests at the British Library document supply service. Another option is communicating via ISO-ILL, a protocol that is used for ILL communications, a standard ISO protocol. This is currently being developed and will continue being developed throughout this year. Another option may be simple emails. So a borrower may simply be sending an email to the lender saying, I want this citation, and the lender will be responding in a simple email saying, okay, I'm sending it away, I'm sending it to you, or I cannot send it, I do have it, but it's lost for a couple of months already, whatever. So the communications may be using standards, such as ISO-ILL, British Library ArtMail, or using non-standard emails, for example. All of this will be in place by the end of this year. As I said, the British Library ArtMail is already supported. So let's expand a bit on the broker-based model. As I mentioned to you, this means there's a system in between the borrower and the lender, the broker system, and ALMA communicates or may potentially communicate with that system using NCIP. NCIP is a standard in ISO, standard in ISO circulation interchange protocol. And actually ALMA works with version 2 of this protocol to support the integration with the resource sharing system. And as we go into the details of the workflow in the next couple of slides, we'll see what exactly this protocol enables ALMA to do when integrating with the resource sharing system. Anyways, currently integrations have been tested and being implemented in two systems, which are actually the first systems that we encountered with the first ALMA development partners. One is the OCLC Navigator system, with which ALMA communicates using NCIP, and another one is a relay system, D2D, discovery to delivery system, which is used by other partners. Both of these systems integrate using NCIP and using ALMA's NCIP support. ALMA supports 5 NCIP messages currently. There are plans to expand that a bit also. But these 5 messages are pretty much enough to set up a full ILL communication between borrower and lender. They're a request item, check out, check in, look up user, and accept item. And again, we'll go into the workflow and see how each such message fits into the workflow for integrating the resource sharing system with ALMA. When we're talking about the peer-to-peer, I've mentioned the ISO-ILL protocol. Again, this is a standard used in many places. Another one is the British Library ArtMail. There's actually another API that's going to be put in place, or is being put in place by the British Library this year and the next to support communications with the British Library Document Supply Service. or the mail exchange option. Okay, so we understand the concept of having a borrower and a lender. We understand the concept of potentially having a broker in between or being able to communicate directly. We understand that these communications go through a resource sharing library. We even understand that there may be more than one resource sharing library managing the resource sharing transactions at any given institution. What we need to put into place now to get the full picture is discuss the workflow and see how all these concepts fit into a full workflow. So just to describe the full workflow, if we have on the left side of this picture, we have a borrowing institution. On the right side, we have a lending institution. And the borrower is going to be sending a request out to the lender saying, I want this resource. If you have it, or I think you may have it, we cooperate in a resource sharing network. We're able to communicate. So please do send me this resource. The request gets created at the lending institution. So an operator sitting at the resource sharing library of the lending institution gets notification that a request has been submitted into his system. So the operator knows there's a request in here, and what to do is find out whether there really exists a resource that may be used to fulfill this request. So this operator is going to be looking into his institution's inventory to see what he has that may be used to fulfill this request. If he finds that something does exist, then if it needs to be shipped in physical format, he's going to be taking actions to make sure that this item is physically moved into the resource sharing library so that our operator can physically lay his hands on this resource and actually change the ownership, temporarily change the ownership of this resource, so that it's going to be marked in Alma's inventory as permanently belonging to the library, but temporarily shelved at the resource sharing library. This is an indication in Alma that the resource is managed for a resource sharing transaction. The very fact that it's temporarily owned by the resource sharing library means that it's currently part of a resource sharing process. So the moment it arrives at the resource sharing library, physically arrives at the resource sharing library, there's a temporary change of ownership. The item temporarily becomes owned by the resource sharing library, and our operator now is going to be physically shipping this item away. Of course, maybe that there is no physical shipment, instead only a digital document delivery is done. In that case, the operator, instead of triggering a process of moving the item into the resource sharing library, will be triggering a process of digitization, meaning it's going to be identifying the resource and going to be asking for digitization of this process. And in the end of this digitization process, the operator is not going to be receiving a physical copy at hand, but instead is going to be receiving a digital copy of the request. And instead of shipping the physical copy away, it's going to be shipping the digital file that he got to the requesting institution. So if we go back to the physical scenario, so an item now arrives, a physical item physically arrives at the borrowing institution at the resource sharing library. That's where it physically finds itself. When that happens, when an operator registers the fact that the item has been received at the resource sharing library, Alma will create a temporary item that is owned by the resource sharing library. So actually what is going to be created on the Alma side is the full tree, meaning a bibliographic description of the title, a holdings record describing the fact that there's holdings at the resource sharing library, and a physical item that may be later loaned out to the patron. So all three levels of the physical inventory are going to be created based on information that is supplied with the request that is being registered. So now we have at the borrower side, at the resource sharing library, bid description, holdings description, and the physical item. And the physical item, in fact, is created with a request, a normal, simple hold request, which identifies where the resource needs to be supplied to. Because when the patron created this request, the patron also identified the requested pickup location where the patron wants to get it. So now the physical item, temporary item that the system has created, is going to have a request associated with it with a pickup location at the library that the patron requested to receive this item. So now the last stage, the last phase of moving the item to the requested pickup location is going to be managed using standard ALMA fulfillment procedures. Wanted in at the resource sharing library, that triggers a move to the requested pickup location just as if it was a normal item requested for pickup anywhere in a different library. There's transit to that library. When the item arrives at the pickup location library, a notification is sent to the patron, item is placed on the hold shelf, and when the patron comes and gets it, a normal load is going to be done at the circulation desk within that library. Of course, libraries may work without this last phase, requiring the patron to step into the resource sharing library, or actually the ILL department, and get the item there. In that case, the pickup location that the patron is able to request is only the resource sharing library itself as a pickup location. And the one then at the resource sharing library, instead of triggering a transit to another library, actually puts the item on the hold shelf of the resource sharing library and sends a notification to the patron at that point. Item is waiting for you for pickup at the resource sharing library hold shelf. And again, this is standard fulfillment process, and the loan process is also going to be standard fulfillment process. The next thing is after the patron made use of the resource and now wants to return it, that's the second half of the workflow. What happens now is that the patron returns the item. This may happen at any circulation desk within any library of the borrowing institution. The patron just returns it just like any standard return. And being that the item belongs to the resource sharing library, as you recall, the item that has been created as belonging to the resource sharing library. So just like any item that is wandered in, not at its owning library, a transit action is triggered to move the item back to its owning library, in this case, the resource sharing library. So the item is going to be moved. This is standard transit, standard fulfillment, ALMA fulfillment process. And when it arrives at the resource sharing library, our operator is going to be registering the fact that the item arrived at the resource sharing library. That will trigger a deletion of this temporary item, full deletion, from the bib down to the physical item. All three levels of the physical item are going to be now deleted from the inventory, and the item is going to be shipped back to the lending resource sharing library. When it physically arrives there, the operator at the lending library is going to be registering the fact that I got this item back. Is going to be winding the item into ALMA at his resource sharing library. And as you recall, the item on this side, on the lending side, is currently temporarily owned by the resource sharing library. So this winding action will trigger a restore request. Now, restore request is another standard ALMA fulfillment process. That is actually a request to move an item that is at a temporary location to move it back to its permanent location. So it's a standard request. It's used in other areas of ALMA as well, such as course reading, or actually wherever a temporary move has been done. And it's a request to move the item back to its permanent location. So the winding in at the lending library just triggers the standard fulfillment process of creating a restore request that actually facilitates the move of the item back to its permanent location. So it's going to be found on a task list to move it back to its permanent location. Wandin will create a transit to its permanent location, and another Wandin at the permanent location is going to do the actual change, or actually remove the temporary shelving information from the item and mark it as reshelved back at its permanent location. And that actually closes the entire workflow. We've had a request. We, at the lender side, got the item, shipped it to the borrower, who moved it to where the patron wants it, and loaned it to the patron, got it back from patron, shipped it back to the lender, who shelves it back at where he got it from. And again, if the supply method was digital, then this whole process of return is of course not relevant. The shipping is only digital. The lending side only has a digitization process instead of a move process being done. And the digitization process, once done, triggers moving the item back to its permanent location, just like in standard digitization process. And the lender is done with it once the lender shipped a request digitally to the borrowing institution. Okay, so we took a look at the workflow. We actually walked through the entire workflow. What I'd like to do in the next couple of minutes is actually look at some of the details of this process, understand what exactly happens at this stage of this process on both the borrowing side and the lending side. Let's start with the borrowing side. We have our patron who wants to receive some item, and we've labeled this the please comment, the please step there, which is the patron requesting the item from the lending. How does that happen in Alma? So we mentioned we have two models. We have a broker system and we have the peer-to-peer model. So with each step in the workflow that we'll discuss in the next couple of minutes, we'll describe both the broker model and the peer-to-peer model. So in case of the broker model, we have the broker system in between. This broker system is aware of the holdings that each of the member institutions possesses. This awareness may be achieved by a publishing process, so that each member library actually publishes its holdings availability into the broker system. In that case, our patron is able to search the broker system using a discovery interface that is supplied by this broker system based on the holdings that have been published into this broker system. Another way that these broker systems may work is based on the 3950 holdings. In that case, there is no physical catalog at the broker system. Instead, there's a virtual one, which is based on the broker system's capability to interact with the member institutions using Z3950 queries that include holdings information in one of the many ways that the 3950 may be used to supply holdings information. So Alma may supply its information into the broker system in one of these two ways. So Alma may be a member institution in this process as by publishing its information or by needing to respond to the 3950 queries, including holdings information. And the patron is just going to be searching this broker system. This broker system is going to be finding out, or is going to be selecting one of the member institutions to place the request at that member institution. In case of the peer-to-peer communication, we have our patron searching Primo or searching any other discovery interface and getting metadata from that other discovery interface or from Primo. Or we may have our patron using an option that is being put into Primo with the next service pack of Primo, that is a citation linker, actually typing in metadata into a blank form. In either case, regardless of whether the metadata has been retrieved from a Primo search or from a Google search, or the metadata has been typed into a form, a citation linking form, in either case, that metadata is going to be sent to Alma, which will create a resource sharing request in Alma that Alma will use to search the different partners to find out who may supply this. So the patron started with some search, got some metadata either by search or by typing it in, submitted this metadata to Alma. Alma now has a resource sharing request in-house managed by Alma, and what Alma will now do is find out which of this institution's members may have this resource and may be able to supply this resource. And now Alma is going to be selecting the the partner that will supply this resource. So instead of having the broker system do that, Alma is going to be doing that. So that's the first step. The first step of submitting the request, either via Primo or via the broker system. The next step on the borrowing side will be when the item arrives. We'll talk about the lending side later. So as far as the borrowing side is concerned, the next thing that happens after the request has been submitted is that something happened out there and an item physically arrived. This item has to be moved to the pickup location. So again, let's look at the broker system option and look at the peer-to-peer option. In case there's a broker system, so when the item arrives, we have an operator that is actually using the broker system, is interacting with the broker system, and it's going to be registering the fact that the item has arrived as the broker system. So it's going to be notifying the broker system, I got this item. And what the broker system is going to be doing, it's going to be notifying Alma, I got this item for a borrowing request. That's the NCIP accept item message. That's what it does. It notifies Alma that there's a borrowing request and I've got the item for this borrowing request. This message includes all of the bibliographic description, request, the pickup location, everything that has to do with the request information. And Alma, when receiving this message, knows that it has to create a borrowing resource sharing request, bib down to the physical item with a request for pickup at the requested pickup location. In short, make sure that Alma has a reflection of the fact that there is a resource sharing request at the broker system. As I said, this may happen based on the NCIP accept item message. In that case, it's going to be automatic. The operator is going to be doing a single wanding action at the broker system. But if there is no such integration, if the broker system does not support NCIP accept item message, the operator can still do manual typing and manually create the request reflection within Alma. And again, input the metadata, the pickup location, everything that the operator copies from the broker system into the Alma system. And in that case, being that there's no integration, the operator is going to be doing that manually. What now will happen is that Alma operators, using Alma interfaces, will take this item and manage the process of moving this item to the library that is the pickup location. So the operator is going to be scanning this item into Alma. Alma is going to be telling this operator, move the item to this pickup location, which is where the patient wants it. At that location, an operator is going to be wanting in this item, and Alma is going to be telling, put it on the hold shelf, setting it on the patron. Patron is going to come into the circulation desk, and he's going to borrow this item using standard Alma interfaces for whole shelf management and for loaning. If there's peer-to-peer, it's not very different, except for the fact that there is no system in between. So we have an Alma operator that is using only Alma and is registering the fact that I got this item using Alma interfaces, but again triggering the same process of moving the item to the requested pickup location where it's going to be placed on a hold shelf and lent to the requesting patron. So we covered the patron getting this item. Now we're going to be looking at the patron returning the item, the last step on the borrowing side. So we have a patron that returns the item. The patron returns it. This action happens using standard fulfillment screens for doing the check-in action at the circulation desk, for moving the item to the resource sharing library, where an Alma operator may wand in this item and get information about this item. This item belongs to the resource sharing system. That's its ID at the resource sharing system. And now our operator at the resource sharing library knows that the item has to be now transferred for the processing of the broker system operator. The broker system operator is going to be registering the fact that you got the item. Now, if there was no ALMA operator that did the first one, then this first step may actually be skipped. So we may have the item from the patron being placed in transit and then managed only by the resource sharing operator up here. And this operator wanting in the item at the resource sharing library at the broker system is going to be doing the notifications for ALMA, notifying ALMA that the item has arrived back. So actually what I described to you is the two ways of doing that. One is the manual typing, where an ALMA operator notifies ALMA that I got the item back. And another is that the resource sharing operator notifies the broker system that I got the item back, and the broker system automatically notifies ALMA that I got the item back. This is done using the NCIP check-in message, and when ALMA gets this message, it knows to close the resource sharing request, delete the temporary item, the BIP record, the holdings, the physical item, and actually close the resource sharing request on the borrowing side. In case of peer-to-peer, it's very much the same, again, without the broker system in between. So we have our operator at the resource sharing library interacting directly with ALMA without any broker in between. So that after the item is returned and put in transit to the resource sharing library, there's only a single one in ALMA to terminate this request. That's the borrowing side. We placed the request, we got the item, we had the patron receive it, we had the patron return it, and ship it back to the lender. Now let's focus on the lending side and see what happens there. So the request has been created and has been registered at the lender side. This happens automatically. The request is registered at the broker system, and again, let's look first at the broker model and then at the peer-to-peer model. In the broker system, request is automatically registered at the broker system, which notifies ALMA automatically that a request has come in. This is done using the NCIP request item message, which notifies ALMA exactly what resource is requested. In the profile, supported that this is done by supplying the OCLC number to ALMA, so that ALMA uses this number to find the resource, the inventory resource within ALMA that matches this request. But again, the operator may manually type in this request into ALMA. So he may, if integration between the broker system and ALMA, the operator may search ALMA, find the requested resource, and place a lending resource sharing request on it manually. In any case, the result of this is a lending request registered in ALMA and linked to ALMA's inventory, so that the operator may now, within ALMA and using ALMA screens, be able to trigger processes to move the item to the resource sharing library in order to facilitate the lending request using a physical item, or to trigger a digitization process if the library wants to fulfill this request using a digital copy. So the request that registered into ALMA either automatically using the NCIP request item message or manually. In either case, we have a lending request linked to the inventory, so the operator using ALMA screens can place requests to move the item to the resource sharing library in order to ship it away to the borrower or to place a digitization request. Peer-to-peer, well, you can guess, is not very different. But instead of having a broker system, the message comes in directly into ALMA. For example, using a ISO message, a request that comes in. But of course, there's also the manual typing here. If we're talking about peer-to-peer, for example, if the peer-to-peer is managed by emails. In that case, we have an operator that receives an email saying, I want this item. This, of course, is not reflected automatically in Alma. We have this operator typing in this request into Alma. In either case, we'll have a request linked to the inventory, where an Alma operator using Alma screens will be able to trigger a move process or a digitization process. Next, the item is shipped away. So the operator got the physical item and is now shipping it away. And the way that this happens, and again, let's look at the broker scenario and the peer-to-peer scenario. If it's a broker system, then the operator is doing the shipment, wanding the item at the broker system. But the broker system is able to notify Alma of the fact that this item has been shipped away using the NCIP checkouts item message. Alma, in response to this message, will know that the temporary change of location needs to take effect, and it will actually change the temporary location of the item so that it temporarily belongs to the resource sharing library as we've described at the beginning of this session. And again, of course, our operator may do this manually by simply wanding in the item into a Alma screen, notifying Alma that this item is now being shipped away, and actually making the temporary change of location take effect. Peer-to-peer, well, you're guessing by now, our operator is going to be doing the same thing, but instead of wanding in at the broker system or doing double wanding at the broker system and in Alma if there's no integration. In this case, the operator is going to be doing a single action of wanding at Alma, and that will trigger the change of location and ship process. So we got the request, we shipped it away. The next and final step for the lending side is when the item is eventually returned by the borrower and again received back at the lending side. Broker scenario, our operator is interacting with the broker system and is wanding in the item at the broker system. And again, there's an NCIP message. This time is the check-in item message, notifying Alma that an item that has been shipped away is now returned, is now being checked in. Alma, in response to this message, will create the restore request that we've mentioned to make sure that the item is now processed to be moved back to its permanent location. And again, if there is no integration, this action may be done manually by scanning in, wanding in the item at the resource sharing library, triggering the restore request, which will now be managed by standard fulfillment processes within Alma to create the transit condition and make sure the item moves back to its permanent location. So by that, we pretty much covered the workflow on both the borrowing side and the lending side. Just to summarize it in 2 sentences, if there is a broker system and that broker system supports the NCIP protocol as it is supported by Alma, integration may be seamless. The operator may be, the resource sharing operator may be working at the broker system, doing all the actions at the broker system, which notifies Alma of the fact that there is a request and there are changes in the status of the request. Alma will be used for the library side of the processor, moving the item to its pickup location, moving it back from its pickup location, moving to the lending resource sharing library, restoring the item back to its permanent location. All that is going to be done in Alma. The rest is going to be done at the broker system. If there is no such integration, then the process is just the same, with the difference being that the operator will now have to do double typing, notifying the resource sharing system and Alma, each one separately, in order to keep them synchronized. Okay, we still have a couple of minutes, So I did put up a few screens just to have, just to help make this a bit more complete. We can go through them briefly, just so you get the picture. So a couple of lending request screens. This is what the lending requests look in Alma. Again, these requests may have been registered automatically by an incoming ISO-ILL request or by a request item input message coming in, either resulting in a lending request or one that has been manually created by an operator based on the email that came in or information that is found at the broker system, which unfortunately does not integrate with Alma. So we have our metadata, we have our requests. The requests are managed by using assignments. So there's a specific operator that is assigned to specific requests. Requests are created without being assigned. You as an operator may pull the request and start working on it. By that, making it assigned to you. The operator may reassign it. It's a concept that exists in many other task lists within Alma. The request has a status. So if the request has been shipped away, it may have a status of sent out. If it's not been shipped away yet, it may have a status of new. If the request has a match in the inventory, it will have a locate status of resource located. If the request came in and it does not match with the local inventory, it may have a status of no resource located. And the request in the task list may be filtered to view only those that are in specific status. Next, what the operator needs to do when working on the lending request is to find out what inventory I have locally may be used to fulfill this request. For this, there's the Manage Fulfillment option, and there is a Print Slip option. Actually, these two options are there to respect the different workflows that exist with regard to how the request is going to be managed at the lender side. Some sites are going to have the operator that is viewing this list directly access the shelves and pull up the items that are needed without the need for any other operator to help in the process. This type of operator is going to be using the Print Slip option. There's actually also an option to print a report with all of the requested items as a single list. And it's going to be using the slip to directly access the shelves and directly fetch the item from the shelf and start the process of shipping it away. That, as opposed to the fulfillment options, which will be used when the items are not at hand for the resource sharing librarian. He cannot himself get the items. He needs to place a request for somebody else. In that case, the operator is going to be using the Manage Fulfillment options, which will bring up a screen such as this, the list of resources that may be used to fulfill this request. In this example, you see there's only a physical option with an item at the law library, which also happens not to be available. So our operator may place a request to make it available. If this item is available, but is far away, is at the law library, which is not near me, I can still place a request to get the item and move it from the law library into my resource sharing library. If there were electronic options or digital options, they would have been also displayed here. And our operator would have known that I have a digital copy of this, or I have an electronic copy which I may digitize and send away. So that shows all of the fulfillment options that our lending operator has for placing with somebody else, manage the request, somebody else get to the shelf, pull the item, and bring it to me, to my resource sharing library, where I'd be able to ship it away. Requests are managed with alerts. This is just to say that an alert is attached to a request whenever something happens with the request that is attached to it. So when the request is placed, when the request is processed, or if the request is canceled, an alert is attached to the resource sharing request. So an operator is able to look at all the requests that I've placed, all the lending requests that I've requested to move, and that have been canceled for some reason. For example, the operators at the law library have not been able to find this resource. Or requests that I've asked to move and are in process, or the process of moving has been completed, our operator will be able to filter this list to look only at requests that are at this specific status. Okay, so these are just a few screens on the lending side. We don't have much time, but in another 2 minutes we can look at some of the borrowing request screens. This is actually where the patron is going to be placing the request from. What we're looking at now is Get It tab in Primo, actually. So in Primo, there are request options. There are the normal request and distribution options, and there are some resource sharing related options. As you see, some of these options have to do with broker systems. So if there's a broker system, that broker system may show up here, and from Primo, the operator, the patron, may jump into the broker system where he can continue with the process of submitting the request at the broker system. And there are different levels of integration at this stage. For example, Iliad allows directly pushing the metadata into Iliad so that the patron moves into Iliad with the metadata that he found already in Primo on his request form already. Other systems have less of an integration option here. So in case of Navigator, integration is only at the level of being able to move into the discovery system, but not taking the metadata with you into that system. So you may need to restart the process of searching and finding the metadata and submitting the request within that discovery system. So the different levels of integration here, systems vary in that. Alma supports different types of integrations. So it may push the entire metadata into the broker system or whatever other integration that system supports. Another option is where Alma is the owner of the request. That's the peer-to-peer model. In this case, there's a link for placing the resource sharing request, which will result in a form for submitting the request into Alma with the metadata as retrieved in Primo. We've mentioned also the citation linker, enabling to type in the information and supplying the metadata into Alma in this manner. So our borrowing request is going to have a list of borrowing requests being submitted into Alma, either from Primo using the forms, or using or pushed into Alma from the broker system using the instead of set item message. In either case, we have a list of borrowing requests within Alma, so that operators may manage it within Alma. For example, to send a query to patron, hey, you requested this and this. We don't have the exact copy that you asked for. Is another copy, would it be okay for you, and so on. So queries may be sent to patrons, and requests may be filtered to find those that are waiting for patron information. The requests have statuses, and the list may be filtered by these statuses. And when the item arrives in Alma, so after it's been wandered in at the broker system, for example, another one thing may happen in Alma based on the external identifier, the request identifier, as it exists in the broker system. So that Alma will trigger the process of attaching a temporary barcode to this item and moving it to where it's requested. Okay, so the operator wandered in the item at the broker system. It doesn't know if it needs to ship it to the raw library or to another library. Alma knows this information. Another one in Alma will let the operator know where exactly the item needs to be shipped to, and will let the operator attach a temporary barcode in Alma. And this is important because without this temporary barcode, the item will not be loanable to any patron. So this one thing in Alma is going to allow the operator to attach the temporary barcode and move the item to the request application. The next and last step on the borrowing side is actually when the item is returned back from the patron. The check-in happened at the circulation desk. The item moved to the resource sharing library, and the wandin at the resource sharing library notifies the operator here that this item belongs to this system, and this is the request ID. So the operator knows that he needs to move it to the broker system operator to manage the request eventually. And as I said, this step may be skipped, and the operator may do wandin directly into the broker system that will notify ALMA using Yanset. These are just a few screens just to help make things a bit more concrete. But basically, these are the only screens that are needed in ALMA for managing the fulfillment and the resource sharing request. Task list for borrowing, one for lending, and the scanning interface that we've looked at for both the borrowing side and the lending side. So that's it. That's pretty much the all the information I wanted to share with you. As we've described the entire workflow on the lending side, on the borrowing side, we've seen the two models that ALMA supports, the broker-based and the peer-to-peer one. We've seen the idea of the resource sharing library and how it comes into play into the process. And as you know, additional development is still being done and is going to be done throughout this year to fully support the peer-to-peer process in the ISO format. Additional enhancements, of course, will be made in the next. So if you have any questions, so now you may email them later, you call me later, whichever way you want. So I'll be hanging around here for another couple of minutes. Questions? Thank you very much.
Moshe, may I ask a question? This is Shmuel.
Hi.
Hi, thank you very much for that presentation. It was very, very clear and thorough and very informative.
Thank you.
Did I understand correctly that if the broker system has been integrated with ALMA, that nevertheless 2 scans would be required when moving items in or out of the resource sharing library? One in ALMA and another in the broker system?
Well, when moving in, that is when receiving one for a borrowing request, that will be the way to attach the temporary barcode. As far as I recall, the message is not able to attach the temporary barcode. I may be wrong about that. But in any case, that's the only step where wanding in ALMA is required, and again, just for the sake of attaching the temporary barcode. In all other parts of the workflow, a single wandin at the resource sharing broker system is enough.
Single wandin at the resource sharing broker system, and that automatically updates ALMA?
Right, that's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, and thank you for this, Moshe. I would like to know about the roles. Could you put some words on which role you need to have as an operator?
The operator in ALMA has a fulfillment services operator role in the scope of the resource sharing library. So if you have a number of such libraries, an operator operates in a number of them, you need a role in each one of them. The role is not at the institution level. It must be created at the resource sharing library level. But that's it. It's a resource sharing. It's a fulfillment services operator role at the resource sharing library. That's it. And that's, of course, this operator is also going to be doing the checkout to the patron, in which case it needs to be a circulation desk operator in addition. But that's for managing the circulation desk aspect of the process. For managing the requests, the task list, and the scan-in, it's a fulfillment services operator, and that's it.
Could you please put this in your slides, because I guess we will have access to the slides later on.
Yes, that's a good idea.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Moshe, could you briefly address the question of terms of use for resource sharing? It seems that there are several different sets of terms of use for resource sharing over and above the normal fulfillment terms of use for requests and loans.
Okay, I was afraid of confusing you all, so I'll speak about this part briefly. I don't want to put everybody off focus here. But the concept, with the concept of the requests or the resources on both the borrowing side and the lending side being owned by the resource sharing library, what this really means is that as far as fulfillment policies are regarded, the policies that control the items are the resource sharing policies. So there's a fulfillment unit at the resource sharing library, and that fulfillment unit is what controls the terms of use by which the item is going to be managed at the borrowing and at the lending. So for example, on the lending side, you may set up a requesting terms of use, which says, which has a single rule with a single terms of use that says no requesting allowed. That will result in any item that is shipped away to fulfill a lending request not being requestable by a patron, a library patron. And on the other side, on the borrowing side, the eventual lending to the patron on the circulation desk is going to be done using the terms of use that you've defined for the loans, the loan terms of use and the loan rules that have been defined at the resource sharing library. So all the standard processes of loan and request are going to be managed at the borrowing side and at the lending side using loan and request rules and terms of use of the resource sharing library fulfillment unit. Now, in addition to that, there are two other types of rules which are managed by the resource sharing library. One has to do with borrowing requests and another with lending. A rule type that is managed, and again, only at the borrowing side, only at the resource sharing library fulfillment unit, enables you to set the borrowing rules, that is, which user groups may place a request, would there be a fee assigned when a request is placed, what are the pickup locations that the patron is allowed. I mentioned pickup locations may be allowed in any library at the institution or may be allowed only at the resource sharing library. That would be part of the borrowing rules. And another special type used at the resource sharing library is a lending rule, which actually sets the amount of time for which the item that is being shipped away is going to be at the temporary location. So it's going to be, for example, saying that anything that is shipped away for 2 months, so that when the item is placed at temporary location at the resource sharing library on the lending side, it's going to have a due back date that is 2 months away. So just to recap that, the standard fulfillment processes of loan and request with the library, with the institution, is managed by the unit of the resource sharing library using standard loan and request use. In addition to that, at the resource sharing library fulfillment unit, there are rules for borrowing terms of use and for lending terms of use. The borrowing rules determine who may place a request, would it be fees, and what are the allowed pickup locations for a request. The lending terms of use and rules affect for how long it's being shipped away on the lending side will be put in temporary location at the library.
Thank you very much.